issued?
Yes, Your Honor. I was presented with a list of three excerpts that the defense was wanting to play out of the November 30th interview with Mr. Segura. There's one section that I do have an objection to. I do not believe that it puts.
We're doing that now. We're doing that later.
Oh, later on today.
Yeah, we can. Let's have a jury plea. We'll deal with that later.
Okay.
Yes.
Everybody be seated. Anybody need to report anything been exposed to? Anybody? No? All right, you may proceed, Mr. Trent.
Mr. Knox, yesterday before we had technical difficulties, we were just about to start talking about some of the issues that you identified with the processing of the crime scene in this case. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay, if we could, let's start with the point of entry first. Can you tell us in a general sense what you looked at, and then walk us through what you're finding?
Well, with the point of entry, as with several other places, various windows and things like that, there was some processing done for fingerprints, though there's other possible available processes that could potentially have yielded other evidence. Now, the reason why that's important is because there wasn't really much found in terms of physical evidence. That happens. Not every crime scene you go to are you going to find fingerprints, or you're going to find, physical evidence that puts somebody there and shows that they were there at the scene. But to the extent that things aren't found, then consideration should be given to other processes that could potentially yield that. So, for example, if you're processing areas for fingerprints, one of the things that would be a good practice is to use what's called an alternate light source before you start to process with powders or chemicals or anything like that, because an alternate light source often will bring up certain types of evidence that you don't see with the naked eye. Certain even potentially fingerprints, hairs and fibers, other sorts of things, depending on what's there, can be brought up just by putting certain colors of light on it. That's basically what an alternate light source is. It's a very expensive flashlight that has the ability to change the color of light that you put on it. There are, certain different chemicals and things like that can be used. So whereas a lot of the processing here on point of entry and some of the windows and things was done with powders, there weren't other things done, and that potentially could mean that there's evidence that just wasn't found that may have been there.
Okay, can you take us through some of the specific areas of the home that were processed, and talk specifically about the types of process that you would have liked to see utilized there?
Yes, and in fact, I probably, I have a lot of that I could do while I'm going through the presentation. That might be a little bit easier to describe it as I'm showing the slides and stuff. If you wanted to go through that way.
Yes, you've prepared a PowerPoint presentation showing pictures from the crime scene that you used in evaluating the processes utilized in this case, correct?
Yes.
And
yes.
would that PowerPoint presentation assist you in explaining your findings to the jury?
It would, yes.
Your Honor, I would at this time publish to the jury what's been marked for identification only as Defense Exhibit 7, which is the demonstrative aid. The substantive evidence, the slides themselves are individually numbered in evidence already at Defense Exhibit 6.
No? What publish to start with that now?
Yes, sir.
All right, Matt.
So beginning with slide number 2, Mr. Knox, kind of take us through and let us know what you're looking at.
Well, this slide is just showing, for orientation purposes, this is the front of the residence. This is, how the house is arranged and where the front door is, and so forth. And then if we go to, this is slide 4. There's showing potential entry exit. This is the master bedroom window. This was found unlocked. It was processed for fingerprints. None were found, and they used fingerprint powder in order to process that. At this area, there were no DNA samples collected. Like I said, there are no fingerprints that were found. They didn't use an alternate light source or any other potential processes, just applied the powders and were unable to recover fingerprints, which, just to be clear, I mean, if you put fingerprint powder on a window at a residence, there's a substantial likelihood that you don't find fingerprints. So the fact that none were found is not in and of itself problematic, but the fact is that there's other evidence that could potentially have been collected from there that just wasn't.
Okay. And when you say potential point of entries, you don't have any reason to believe this is or is not the point of entry. You're just wanting to look at all possible points of entry and gather all possible relevant forms of forensic evidence. Is that right?
Right. What would typically be done if you're looking at a crime scene is, unless you have a readily identifiable point of entry and point of exit, then you would look at all possible places. So all doors, all windows, look at the status of the locks on those things, and try to come up with, what are the possibilities. Because obviously any window that a person may have been able to come in or out is an area that you would want to look for physical evidence of a particular person, because you have to get in and out of a house somehow. So that's what we would typically do in a crime scene.
Okay. Any other areas that you looked at that you had concerns about the processing technique?
There are some others that I think will come up as we go through the slides. Let's see. Slide 5, this is showing the bathroom window, just showing the lock. This is showing that this is actually the condition that the lock was documented in. So this is a photograph that they took and showing that it was unlocked. But again, it's closed, it's just unlocked, so it's could possibly be an area of a point of entry or exit, but it's not definitively so. And then 6, this is a showing that the bathroom window, that the screen was torn. Now, it's my understanding that they had determined that damage had occurred several weeks prior. So the torn screen apparently was eliminated as having been related to this particular incident. There was no mention in the crime scene reports of whether or not there was any processing that was done to the interior exterior of that window right there. Then slide 7, this is showing the back door, which is at the north end of the hallway. Doorknob was locked, deadbolt was unlocked, which of course would mean that potentially somebody could go out that way, lock the doorknob on their way out, and not have to have had a key to be able to lock the door. There were some, there's no blood stains or anything that were documented in this area leading up to this door or anything like that. There wasn't any processing done with the alternate light source or any. There's also a chemical that they used in other areas called LCV, or leucocrystal violet, which is used to bring out enhanced impressions in blood, and that was not used here. And again, I would say I'm not being critical of the fact that it wasn't used, but just pointing out the fact that there is potential evidence that could be found having done that's not, without doing the process, you just don't know. Okay, and in slide 8, this is a curtain at the back door. You saw in the previous slide, and there is a stain, which is right here next to this scale. And that stain was chemically tested. It gave indications for the presence of blood, and it was matched by the DNA to Brandy Peters. But again, in this area, there wasn't any other searching with an alternate light source or any blood enhancement chemicals. So again, potentially missed opportunity. There could be things that you could be found that way. Now, you might do it and not find anything, but again, if you don't do it, then you certainly won't know if there's something there or not.
Was that curtain close enough to Brandy Peters that spatter from the area where she was ultimately found could have impacted that back curtain, or no?
No, and that's kind of the observation that in the area of the hallway, the carpet, the walls, everything around here, there's no blood spatter, there's nothing there, means that there's no bloodletting event going on near that. So the most likely explanation for blood to be there would be transferred. Person gets her blood on them and then touches that curtain and then transfers that blood, because that stain is not, it doesn't appear to be spatter. That may well just be transferred blood.
What do you mean when you say transfer blood exactly?
Well, transfer is any time that blood goes from one object to another and then in between. So the most commonly seen way of transferring blood at a crime scene is a person gets blood on them, and that could be a person that's a perpetrator, that could be a person who is a victim, or even sometimes it happens when people come into the crime scene afterwards, first responders or what have you, and they happen to get blood on them. And then once you get blood on you, then you go and you touch something. And then when you touch it, you transfer blood from you to whatever you touched. And so what we'll see often in a crime scene is areas where you have blood that is present that is clearly transferred, because we can look at the type of pattern that it has and the way it appears and determine that it's not spatter. Spatter would be more of that some event occurs, an impact, and that causes blood to be spattered away, and then we'll see a different type of pattern for that.
Okay.
Okay, then the interior area, this is the master bedroom. And just kind of showing you the layout. Here's the bed, the condition that the bedroom was in. There are a number of different items that'll come up as we go through the slides, but you can see like there's a purse down here, some items on the bed, various different things. There's a phone we'll look at in just a minute. Here, just looking a little bit to the right of the bed, you see that there's the telephone on the floor. The telephone base is here, the handset is here, and telephone cord. The telephone cord had actually been cut. Then also on the bed right in this area, there's some, again, transferred blood, meaning you've got blood from likely a person. That person comes in contact with the corner of the bed, and it leaves that blood there. It's not spatter. This is just transfer, which means that the whatever caused the blood may not have happened right there. The person could have had an injury that happened in one area, and they went to that area and then transferred blood.
With respect to the phone cord, you say the phone cord is cut. What indications are there that the cord is cut as opposed to like ripped in half?
It's a pretty clean break. In fact, a couple more slides, there's a close-up photograph of it, but it's very clean as opposed to if you tear a cord. Wires don't generally break in the middle without a substantial force, and you'll pull things apart. You'll pull the wire insulation apart and stuff like that, and this is just a pretty clean cut.
Okay.
Okay. Slide 12 here, this is a close-up showing the fitted bed sheet toward the corner of the bed, and there are several blood stains. There's one here, 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 and there's one up here. Those are stains that gave chemical indications for the presence of blood, and DNA was matched to Brandy Peters, so it's obviously her blood. And why it's important when talking about the blood on the bed that I showed, this is the close-up area of showing that blood, is that this is where you're beginning to see blood from Brandy Peters. What happens in prolonged confrontations and attacks where there's generally escalating violence, there's an increase in the amount of violence that takes place. There will be initial injuries, and in the area where those initial injuries have taken place or where people have been immediately subsequent to that, there's generally a small amount of blood. And then as more injuries are inflicted, then the amount of blood you see in an area will start to increase. And we use that often to sequence where somebody went and where they were as an event progressed. So you can often sort of track a person and where they've gone through an area and see the increasing injuries because you begin to see increasing blood flow. All right, and slide 13, this is showing a little bit closer up of the phone. The phone was examined for DNA evidence. There was mixed DNA. Brandy Peters was the major contributor. Both Mr. Segura and all the children were eliminated as being potential contributors. So the implication of that is that if you have mixed DNA, meaning that you have DNA from more than one person, the only person apart from Brandy Peters, that there's DNA there from somebody that's not been identified. So who that may be, there's no way to know, but it's an indication that there's DNA from more than one person, and Brandy Peters is included, but Mr. Segura and the children are excluded. This is a close-up here of the phone cord, and again, you can see that you're talking about a pretty clean break right here, as opposed to something that's been torn, so it would appear to be cut. I'm not saying that definitively, but it would appear to be more of a cut because it's a pretty clean break. There was a DNA sample taken from the phone cord, mixed DNA again of 3 or more individuals, the major contributor being Brandy Peters. Our minor contributor was possibly Brandy Peters and possibly Javante. Major contributor was the twins, and Mr. Segura was eliminated from that. So that's, again, DNA profiles there that could...
Let's be clear to the jury, though. This gentleman is not a DNA expert, although he purports to be reporting DNA results. You should rely on the experts in that field, not this witness. Okay?
This is the wall right next to where the phone cord is, and there are some black scuff marks. You can see they've been pointed out here that were on the wall. Those were cut out. The crime scene investigators actually cut those sections of wall out, but it was never submitted to a lab for any type of analysis to see what the material is that made that. Because obviously the proximity to the phone, what you'd be interested in is what made those scuff marks. Where did it come from? Is it from a shoe? What type of material is it? That wasn't ever checked to see. Now, again, I'm not trying to represent that you necessarily would have found anything, but certainly it wasn't checked, so there's always the possibility that something that could have been matched to another material somewhere else that may have provided additional evidence. Similarly, this is at the exterior side of the master bathroom door. So this is the master bedroom area here. This is the master bathroom area. A similar scuff mark at the bottom of that door. And again, that scuff mark is photographed, it's documented, not any testing to try to determine what the material is that the scuff mark is made of. And this is just a closer view showing that scuff mark on the bottom of that door. And you can also see on this one that in addition to the scuff mark here, there's also a similar appearance, dark material on the floor. So whatever produced the scuff mark likely also put some of that material on the floor as well. And if you go a little bit closer in that, you can see that not only do you have the scuff mark, but you actually have some residue there that's adhered to the door in addition to the scuff mark. So again, the question would be, what is that residue? Where did it come from, and what could it be matched to? Okay, slide 19, we pointed out earlier, there's the purse right here. This is the master the bed in the master bedroom, and here's the purse that was at the foot of the bed. There was some DNA on there. In Brandy Peters, Mr. Segura was eliminated from that DNA.
Your Honor, I am going to object to him keep reciting the DNA results if he wants to talk about whether, I'm sorry, object to that.
Let's stay out of the DNA result, please, sir. You've not been qualified in that area.
Okay. Here is a closet door. We're actually, this photograph, you're in the master bedroom looking out toward the hallway. There is a closet in the hallway right there, and in the door there is a bullet hole. Okay. The bullet hole, you can actually see a little bit closer view. This is actually taken from in here. This is between two of the bedrooms. This is Javante's bedroom on this side, and this is the twins' bedroom on this side, and then here's the closet door and the bullet hole right here in the door. Okay, and then this is the door with a trajectory rod inserted through the bullet hole. So they place the rod in it, which is typically done in order to try to figure out the trajectory. What direction did the bullet come from is what you're interested with that, because that will point back in the direction, and you follow that line back, and then you can make some determinations about where the shot was fired from. The trajectory rod was put in there. There doesn't appear in the documentation to be any determination of exactly what position the door was in, because obviously with a door, one consideration is the door could have been open to whatever angle, which can affect where the shot actually came from. There weren't any angles recorded as far as exactly what angle it came in at, other than what you can see generally from the photograph. But the general direction of it does point back toward the bedroom, so it would tend to indicate that the shot's fired probably from somewhere inside that bedroom. And the bullet for that is placard number 17, is actually found right inside the closet. And this is a little bit closer view to show the bullet as found right there.
Just to make sure I understand what you're saying so far. So the first shot that you're talking about here, it's fired from an area inside the bedroom back towards generally the exit of the bedroom, is that right?
That's right, yes.
Okay.
There was a silver bracelet also that, what happened here? Okay, I don't know where that came from. There's a silver bracelet that is right here on the floor. This is the master bedroom door. And this bracelet, again, it was found right in that location. This is a close-up of that bracelet. Then also this is...
Was that bracelet examined for DNA?
It was not, no.
Okay.
This photograph here, shows where a bullet perforated one of the windows in the master bedroom. And you can see it's circled right here. There's actually a trajectory rod in there, and it's up high on the window. And it was described as being at an upward angle. Again, the actual angle wasn't recorded, just what's shown with the dowel, but it was described in one of the reports as being, it appeared to be at an upward angle.
And that is the trajectory of that bullet going out of the house?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So there's at least one shot that's going towards the exit of the bedroom and one shot in the bedroom going in the opposite direction?
That's right, yes.
Okay.
And then this is the photographer is standing in the master bedroom looking into the master bathroom. This is where the toilet is. So in this particular master bathroom, you have bathroom area, and then you have a separate room, basically, where the toilet itself is. And the door to that, we have another bullet impact that is, you can see there's a trajectory rod in it. It's going into the door, going at a downward angle into that door. And then again, general direction it's coming from would be from the area of the master bedroom, so coming from the direction of the master bedroom. This is a different shot of that same bullet. So here you can kind of see the angle of the trajectory rod. It's coming downward, you can draw back that line, and you can actually place a shooter at a pretty good approximation of where they were when they fired the shot. What was done here is they put the rod in, they took some photographs of it, but they didn't actually measure those angles. So without that information, you can't determine exactly how far away the person was. But I think the important thing here is that it's generally coming from the direction of the master bedroom. And then this is the shower enclosure in the master bathroom, and we have an actual bullet impact right here. You can see where the bullet impacted the metal portion. That caused the glass to shatter. When you have just an impact like that, you can't put a trajectory rod in that, so you can't really figure out the direction other than just getting some general sense of it. And also in that master bathroom, there are 2 bullets. There's one on the floor over here. There's one on the floor over here that were recovered. So obviously, likely that this one out here would be associated with the strike to the shower door, and the one inside would be associated with the one that went through the door to the toilet room. This is the master bedroom door as viewed from out in the hallway, and there is some blood. There's actually a transfer stain of what we call a swipe, and a swipe is a transfer stain that shows movement. So in other words, if I had blood on my hand and I walk up and I touch that, I make a transfer stain. But if I come up here and I run my hand across it, then I make what's called a swipe. And you can actually see lines in the swipe that not only show that there was movement, but will show you the direction of movement, so you know which way it was coming from. And in this case, the direction of movement is that it's coming from the bedroom toward the hallway. So that indicates whatever the blood source is obviously moving out toward the hallway. This is most likely, given the height and the location of it, would be most likely associated with the gunshot wound that Brandy Peters had to her left shoulder. So what's kind of getting indicated here, and you'll see as you move through it, is that her initial injuries are happening inside the bedroom, and then she's now fleeing from the bedroom into the hallway, and then there's going to be additional blood that moves toward the front door and actually is outside the front door. And this being a close-up of that particular stain, again, you can see that you have this contact here and here, and we have feathering in this direction, which it tells us that's the direction of travel. So that puts her coming from the bedroom and then out toward the hallway. Okay, that's the same area. Let's see. This is just to give you an orientation in the hallway. So this is the master bedroom that we were just looking at. Here's the twins' bedroom, the closet where that one bullet impact happened, Javante's bedroom here, this hallway bathroom is up here, and then that's the front door right there. So the movement of the blood, as we'll see, comes from here and then down the hallway, then toward that front door. There were several stains that were sampled here, all these, number 3, 4, 5, and 6, from the carpet that were all sampled and all were determined not to be blood. Then a little bit further down, number 7, that was also sampled and was not blood. And then number 8 right here was sampled, and that turned out to be blood.
Does the lack of blood staining through the hallway indicate that she's not bleeding very badly at that point?
Right. What that tells you is that she obviously she has to have an injury because she has some blood, but you don't have the level of injury where you have dripping blood, where you have blood that's coming off of her and then leaving a blood trail as she moves. So it means that there's some injury, but she hasn't suffered all the substantial injuries that she ended up suffering. So what you're again seeing is sort of an increasing amount of blood. So this is sort of at the beginning parts of the bloodletting injuries, and then it's going to move progressively toward increasing injury. This is just a close-up showing that blood stain on the hallway floor there. So by the time she gets to number 8, there's at least enough that you're seeing some dripping of blood onto that carpet. Number 9, there's a lamp right here. This has been knocked off. Obviously, this would not be the normal position for it. And this is right at the corner of the hallway area as you start to get to the front living room area.
Just to clarify, the track that you've showed us to this point, coming from the bedroom, going down the hallway and into the living room on the way to the front door, was the LCV used to process that area and enhance their ability to find additional blood drops or blood transfer?
I don't think that there was LCV used in those areas. There's some various areas where they did use it on the walls. I'd have to be sure we'll get to those other areas in the slide presentation, but I don't think that they used it right in that area of the carpet.
Okay.
Okay, then this is the exterior side of the hallway closet door. This is again the same one where you can actually see the bullet hole that we talked about earlier, but there was also a blood stain right there. And this is a drop of blood that's in flight. Could be from an impact, could be from some type of a cast off, but it means that this is not a transfer where somebody with blood touched. This is blood that actually flew through the air and a drop deposited on that door in that location. And then also lower down on that door, there's additional blood here. And this is blood that's coming down. This could be either from cast off or from some type of impact or anything like that. So in other words, you could have, this could be from Brandy Peters, just through her own movements, that she casts blood off of her and it ends up on this door. It could also mean that there's some type of violence that takes place right near this door that causes this blood to be spattered onto the door. This is the bedroom door to Javante's room, which is just, if you're moving out the hallway toward the front door, it's just past that closet door. And again, there's another drop of blood right there. And this is another view of that same door to Javante's bedroom, and there's some additional blood that's documented on there. So, and this is blood you've got spattering here because you actually can see some small drops. They have tails to them, which gives you the direction of travel of that blood. So the likelihood here would be either something that she does, could be running into the wall or something like that, or probably more likely would be that there's some interaction going on here with whoever's attacking her. And this is just a close-up of some of those stains that we just saw. Again, you can see how they are they have defined tails to them, and these are drops that are in flight that strike, and then the tails indicate the direction that they were going, and the fact that they're really long like that means that they're pretty close to the door. The angle is very shallow and close to the door. Then here we have another one of the stains that was on that door. These are swipes right here. So that would indicate some contact, most likely contact between Brandy Peters and the door. And the swipe marks are pointing toward the front door. So again, more blood that shows a movement from the bedroom and then toward the front door. And then toward the bottom of the door, there's an impact stain, or it's a drop in flight again. This is a close-up of it. Elliptical shape, has a tail to it showing direction, so it's coming downward, strikes the door, and again, that could be either from her movements, the blood drop is being cast off, or it could be that there's interaction going on, and that would cause potentially an impact or something to her that would cause that blood to be put into flight. And then here is the door frame area to the same door, and there's some more blood there as well. Then on the wall just past that door, there's another blood stain, again another one of a blood in flight, and this is a close-up of it. So you have a blood drop that is very close to the wall. That's very, very shallow angle when it's elongated like that. If a blood drop were to hit straight on, it would be perfectly round, and then as you decrease the angle, it becomes more and more elliptical shape. So when it gets to where it's really long like that, it means it's very close to the wall. This is the wall, and you can see that the lamp is here. This is like at the end of the hallway. You're kind of going into the living room right here. And again, there's blood here as well. These are, what you have is some blood that is deposited, and then you've got dripping. The blood is actually running down the wall. And there's some, here, a little bit of a swipe indicating direction, and up here a little bit of a swipe indicating direction. Most likely Brandy Peters making contact with the wall, moving toward the front door. This is the east wall of the hallway. So again, you can see the front door here. So where we were just looking at the wall on the right, this is now on the wall on the left in the same orientation. And where this yellow circle is, there's another blood stain right there. And that one is this stain, again, it's directional, pointing toward the front door, very close to the wall. And that is another indicator of her path of travel toward the front door. And then this is an earring that is found near that wall on the floor. As you go out toward the living room area, you see that there's a number of scattered items about. There's this plant that's been overturned here, and then it continues toward where the front door is. This is the front door, and what we'll see here, there's actually some blood right outside, and in fairly small quantities, similar to what you see in the hallway. So what that would mean is that she's gotten not only to the front door, but actually made it outside the front door. And then as she goes outside the front door, there's some impact spatter on the wall. So the front door would be this to the left right here. There's impact spatter, a swipe right there. The impact spatter means that she's struck at that point. That you have an impact that's causing blood to spatter, and you have multiple drops that are traveling, and they all sort of converge back to a common location. So that means that what happens is she gets out the door, and then there's a continuation in violence. So once she gets out the front door, then she's attacked again. There's some blows delivered that cause this impact spatter.
How high off the ground is that impact spatter?
That spatter is about, looks like, I think in the neighborhood of about 4.5 feet or so, 4 feet. Might be a little bit higher. This is based on what you have here as far as the angles, then she's still upright, definitely, and that there's some type of impact happening while she's upright.
And the small quantity of blood, maybe you mentioned this, but I just want to make sure I understand. So we know that she's made it out of the house before she sustained the types of debilitating injuries that we see, which ultimately caused her death. Is that right?
Right, exactly. Because as I said, here you have very little blood. You're not dripping blood all over, as opposed to when you go back into the foyer area, there's a substantial amount of blood, which means that the majority of her injuries happen after she's outside, and then comes back into the foyer area, and then there's substantially more violence that takes place there. So that's how you're able to sort of sequence based on the volume of blood, because the volume of blood would always be increasing, not decreasing.
Were you able to tell, or are you about to tell us what the directionality of that impact spatter in this slide is?
The impact spatter, the directionality is this way. So it's converging down here, which means that the location where the blood source is. So if she's got a wound and there's an impact that happens to that wound, would be at roughly this height in this area here. And then these drops are spattering out this way. So it's an impact that is viewed in the photograph would be generally a right to left impact with probably some upward angle, because you have drops that are going upward as opposed to, there's very few that are actually traveling downward there. Then this is the swipe, a little closer view of it. The swipe also has direction indicated by it. That direction is back toward the door. So again, this is how you can determine that she comes outside and then she's stopped at some point and then is moved back into the foyer area, because that swipe is now going back in the opposite direction. All the ones we saw in the hall were all moving out toward the door. Now you have a swipe that's moving back from the outside back toward the inside of the house. And then you have, again, this is a little bit closer of the impact stains, and one of the key things here is that you have some differences in direction, so there's more than one. I couldn't tell you exactly how many, but there's not just, if you have one single impact, then all of the drops should converge back to one common area. Whereas if you have ones where there are differences in direction and they don't all converge to the same common area, then that would indicate that there's more than one impact. So, certainly there's something happening here that correlates to the movement back into the foyer.
Does the different directionality of the impact spatter indicate that the impacts are being inflicted from different angles?
Yes, it would generally mean that there's some slightly different angles. Now that can be, if I'm striking somebody like this, I mean, no two blows are going to be exactly the same and strike exactly the same way, but yes, there's some variance in that.
And with these ones here, are some of them moving in opposite directions?
Yes, yeah, there are actually some opposites where you have downward left to right. This one down here is actually the drop direction is downward left to right, and then you have this one left to right, and then you have this one is upward right to left, and one that's laterally right to left. So there's more than one impact here. Then this one is just kind of showing, they drew lines of convergence here, which is what we do with blood spatter impact stains, because the lines of convergence bring you back to where relative to that surface did this impact occur. So we would bring the lines of convergence down, and then you'd come straight out from that some distance that we're able to measure through measuring the angles of the drops, and you can figure out exactly how far away it happened. But the key thing is that those lines of convergence means that wherever the blood letting wound is that's impacted is right about here, and you can kind of see that's sort of doorknob height, roughly in that level. Then this is just orientation. That spatter that we were just looking at is right here relative to the door. Here's the front door, and that's where that spatter is. So it's just outside the door, just a few feet outside the door. And just to point out that purplish discoloration all over the door, that's where the leucocrystal violet was used to process the door. Typically when you see blood and there's a potential where you're looking for fingerprints or any type of transfer evidence, could be footwear impressions, you would use some type of blood enhancement chemical, leucocrystal violet being one of the ones that you could choose to use to try to bring out impressions that are not readily visible. Often what will happen is you apply it and then you'll bring up impressions that you just couldn't see without having applied the chemical.
Was that wall that you were just showing us with the blood spatter processed with LCV?
I don't think so, no. They did, obviously, the door area all through here, but I don't believe that wall was actually processed.
Okay.
Then this is the inside of the front door, and there's some transfer pattern up here, small swipe mark there, swipe here, and you can see that there's some differences in direction here. There's a swipe moving down this way and then across here. But again, right around the door area, we have fairly small quantities. On the floor and the surrounding areas is where the quantities of blood begin to become much more significant. This is just showing, again, this is a different view of the area. And this, of course, this broken glass here is not related to the actual incident that was done by the responding officers. Then if we look at the floor, the ground right outside the door, there are some blood patterns as well there. There's some dripped blood here, and there's some transfer patterns on the ground itself.
What does the combination of drip, blood, and transfer pattern mean when viewed together at a single spot like that?
Well, it means obviously that you have a blood source that's continuing to drip. So you have somebody's got an injury there, and then you have the transfers that are indicating that there's something going on, some type of movement. This fits with the impact spatters and things, that there's obviously struggle taking place at this point. So what would tend to be indicated by that is that she made it out the door, didn't make it very far. Made it a few feet outside the door, and then she's now being attacked again. And that's why you have blood in different directions. You've got transfers on the ground. You've got blood dripping. You've got impact spatters because there's some violence taking place here, and then it moves back into the foyer. This is obviously the way that our body was found. This is the foyer area, and of course, we've got some pretty substantial blood in this area, much more significant than you see outside. So that would indicate that the majority of her injuries, particularly these blunt force impacts to her head that are this source of this blood, are not occurring until in the foyer. And that's when you see blood spatter like this, where you have this is cast off spatter that's going all the way up to the ceiling, above the door height and stuff, then you're talking about some pretty severe impacts, and with some type of weapon that has a little bit of length to it. So typically, when as you see blood spatter, you go higher and higher on walls and get up into the ceiling, then you're typically talking about objects that have a little bit more length to them than something that's very short. Short objects, you'll tend to see all that spatter lower down, whereas when you start to get into longer objects, if you take something the length of, say, a tire iron or a baseball bat or things like that, then it's not uncommon to see blood spatter not only up the walls, but on the ceiling above and things like that. And again, this just showing the door area. And for orientation, that's the south wall, that's the west wall. And you can see that there's substantial blood stains all the way up in this wall, up here, and you see these large drops. They're actually traveling downward, which means that they have to go up in the air higher than where they are and then come down in order to impact that. So you're, again, indicators that you're talking about a weapon with a little bit of length to it. This is now showing the east wall. Again, we have sort of the same thing. You have spatter that's all over the wall, as high up as you can see in this photograph, and then you have these very large drops and things that are coming downward. And even up high, we have downward drops. So, I mean, you can see the height that we're at. Here's the light switch area. It's quite a bit higher than the light switch. These drops up here are traveling downward, so they have to have either gone up in the air and come back down or originated somewhere higher than that level. The base of the door here, there's substantial blood transfer. And you can actually see like multiple round-looking shapes to that. That's most likely from her head. So there's struggling going on here with her on the floor, and it's touching the door at the base of the door. And then, of course, you got radiating spatter that's going upward here, as well as some of these drops that are traveling downward. But we actually have upward spatter in this area as well. The upward spatter, if we were to draw this back, and it wasn't done at the scene, but you can get at least a general sense from looking at the photographs that some of these blows are happening. She's still upright, and then obviously at some point she ends up on the floor, and then there are additional blows that are happening. And this just showing a little bit closer view again, where you can kind of see that you have lots of transfer, and then you have swipes here, some various different movements. So there's movement going on, most likely, of her moving around on the floor, and her head is contacting the door there. Impact spatter on this wall. Get a lot of downward drops over here. And then there's actually a transfer pattern right here that's most likely from a hand. And there you can see there's some impact spatter on top of it, but then those delineations would be consistent with fingers, and that there would be consistent with palm of the hand, which you see that a lot of times in attacks like this, because if a person, by this point, there would be a substantial amount of blood, and if she's trying to get up, touches the wall, or if the person who is attacking her is, again, going to probably have blood on their hand and then could reach up and touch the wall. So that would be what you would see there. And there's some downward movement also to this. The feathering and stuff indicates that impression not only touches the wall, but it sort of slides down a little bit. And then below that, on the wall, there's some additional transfer patterns there, and what you have is transfers that have a lot of different directions to them. So again, this is a very substantial attack that's going on here. There's a lot of movement and a lot of different directions of blood. And then there are some impacts actually present here on the floor. You can see a lot of this radiating spatter in here. On this side of the floor, though, you'll notice that there aren't. So you have a lot of impact radiating spatter on one side and not on the other, so that would indicate now her head is over in this area and there's impacts to the head, and then her lower body is down here, so that means that whatever's occurring over here, she's not on the floor. She's upright in some manner. May not be fully standing, but she's upright in some manner, and then ends up over here, and then on the floor there's additional impacts that take place. And there were multiple different transfer patterns apparent here in this blood. And again, you've got a lot of stuff happening over here on this side of the room. There's, in this area right here, there is a transfer pattern. And that's the transfer pattern. And that would appear to be likely footwear impression because you have very delineated lines to it.
Can you tell what direction the shoe is facing?
Based on the shape, you're looking at heel over here and toe this way.
And how is that oriented to the door?
That would be oriented where you'd be looking at left foot pointed toward where her head, the blood was on the head, and the door would be off to the right here.
Can you go back out to a wider shot and show us kind of where this shoe impression would be and which direction it would be facing?
It would be right here facing this way.
And which direction did this door open to? Like, how did the door open?
The door is actually hinged. You can actually see one of the hinges right here.
And so if the front door were being opened and someone were accessing this area, they would step, the door would be opening this direction and blocking that shoe impression. Is that right?
Right. You would open it and then would tend to come in this way because obviously her body was here, so you couldn't open the door fully wide at that point.
And likewise, if someone were going back out this direction, the door would be opening this way, again, blocking the shoe impression, blocking this part of the area relative to the door. Is that right?
Right. Then there are some additional transfer patterns, one here and one here. And those are, this transfer pattern here is likely hand swipe on the floor. And then this impression, this one is, just for orientation, the hand would be right here, this other one is right there, and that would be this pattern. And let's see, okay. There's a blood drop right in this area. You have a transfer pattern right in here, and you can see that there's some shape to that transfer pattern.
What does the shape to that pattern mean?
Well, the shape would correspond with whatever made it. And you have kind of a couple of places where you have a sort of rectangular type shape to it. That would be consistent with footwear. I mean, it's not a full impression, so it'd be difficult to say much about it other than, it's something that's got those square shapes to it. Of course, the most likely explanation is footwear because that's what would be in contact with the floor and would likely have some type of shape pattern like that.
Are you able, based on this limited pattern, are you able to form any kind of opinion about the direction that the footwear, assuming it were footwear, was facing, or no?
No, not really.
Okay.
And then there's a blood drop right over here, right at the edge of the tile. And that blood drop is actually, you have some transfer blood here, blood drop is on top of it, and you have, in that transfer, again, you have shapes of multiple small rectangular shapes. Again, not really enough there to look at it and identify exactly what it is, but obviously footwear would have that type of pattern to it, and footwear would be in contact with the floor, is what you would expect. But the key thing is that with this particular impression, you have a drop of blood that is on top of it.
What does that indicate?
Footwear impression first, blood drop second. Because if you made contact, if the drop was already there and then the object made contact with the tile, then it's going to disturb the blood drop. And the blood drop is undisturbed, so it's actually sitting on top of the impression. So whatever made that impression, the blood drop has to have occurred subsequent to that.
When you find an appropriate stopping point, Mr. Prince, if I'm not moving the blood.
You read my mind, Your Honor. With it, now's a fine time for a break.
All right, we'll let the jury step out. We'll stay in session. You can be seated, Mr. Fuchs, you want to be heard.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. As I said, there were 3 excerpts that were given to me by the defense for the purposes of rule completeness issues on the sections of the statement that was given by Mr. Segura. I don't have a problem with the first 2. Many parts of the third one I don't. And just for references, Mr. Prince wants to play page 164, and I don't have an extra copy for Your Honor, but I'll provide it to you, the one I do have here. It starts on page 164, line 15, and goes on to page 169, line 20. The issue that I have actually starts on page 166, line 16, to the end of that section that Mr. Prince wants to play. There seems to be a lot of self-serving hearsay there that doesn't put the remaining sections that the state played into context in any way, shape, or form. They are actually statements of that talk about money and motive in the situation. If the court recalls, the sections that the state played all had to do with or mostly had to do with Mr. Segura talking about where he was, his alibi, and locations and things of that nature, not the monetary aspects behind the motive behind this. So the state would object as to those sections being self-serving hearsay that are not a part of the rule of completeness, because it doesn't help to put anything else that had been played into context.
Some way I need to see what you're talking about.
Yes, sir. I'm bringing it up to you right now.
Well, the 3 right here are the ones that Prince has done. That's the section that I have the protection.
Mr. Prince?
Your Honor, throughout portions of the interview with the defendant, there is a suggestion made by the officers that he should admit that he's lying, come forward with the truth, and that the purpose, if not directly mentioned, is certainly inferred or suggested by the officers during the course of their interview. The defendant's state of mind relative to those accusations during the time of the interview is relevant to showing his interview in context and the other questions and answers in context. That would be my position.
Okay. Give me a minute to read what you said. Well, it would seem like the last paragraph is the most what the right term would be the farthest from what the state presented their information for. Candidly, the law on completeness is kind of all over the place. I've given you two cases that I think, recent cases that I think clarify what the purpose of it is, and the ultimate purpose is to be fair in the presentation of statement. But given the fairly confused state of the law, I'm not going to try to call this too closely. So I'm going to overrule the objection as to those. I understand the state's argument, and I think perhaps you're right, but given the confusion in the law, I think I would be at great risk to try to call this too closely. So I'm going to overrule the objection. Anything else? No. All right, we'll take 5 minutes. You're in the courtroom. May I continue, Mr. Brent? Everybody be seated. Been leaving those back lights on. Are y'all able to see this all right? Yeah. It just get it too dark, then I think everybody has a tendency to fall asleep.
Turn that light out right behind the screen.
Yeah, I did put that one off.
All right, Mr. Knox, you were telling us about, is it a transfer pattern that we're looking at circled here on slide 91?
Yes, there's a what appears to be a transfer pattern in that area. There's a closer view of it. And there's some, you can see these lines, and they're sort of angled. So you have lines in this direction, then you have lines in this direction. And there are, off to this side, again, there's several small lines spaced apart from one another. It's not much of a pattern, so it would be very difficult to figure out exactly what it's from, but when you have lines angled like this, stacked on top of one another, again, similar to what you would see on a footwear impression, and that's different in shape than the other ones that have the more rectangular type shape to it.
Are you able to tell directionality with respect to that potential footwear impression?
Not really. That's it's only partial, and it's quite obscured because it's blended in with the other blood that's around there. So it'd be very difficult to tell much in the way of direction.
Okay. And where is that footprint or potential footprint relative to the front door?
It is the front door is up here, and so it would be right over there toward the kind of straight across from the middle of the front door.
Is this where Ms. Peters' head was found, when her body was located?
Yes.
Okay. And so if someone were entering the front door, with the front door opening this way, they would likely proceed around the body that way, is that correct?
That's what I would expect, yes. That's what I would certainly do.
Okay.
And this is just a little bit closer view where, again, you can kind of see these lines like this. Lines, line, 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 line. And then these smaller ones over here on this side. And also in these areas that are circled in yellow, there are some more transfer patterns. And one here toward the edge of the carpet in this area. If we go to the next slide, it's a closer in. And again, you can see we have some swipes in here with some differing directions, and you have obviously a pattern here that has some stacked lines like that, where you have parallel lines that are across that impression. And then the other area of it, similarly, again, we have sort of an impression. You can see lines right in there. So there's small impressions, there's not enough there to really make much out of them, but certainly there are some impressions that are present in there which would tend to indicate something deposited blood or made those impressions. This one in particular, you'll note that you have these lines in the impression this way, and then you have this blood here that's across it that's not disturbed. It's not correspondingly disturbed. So the impression that's under it would have happened first, and then you've got the blood that's placed over the top of that.
Are those, the impressions that you see consistent with footwear, or are those more likely from the struggle that took place, parts of Ms. Peters' body rubbing around on the floor?
I wouldn't be able to say necessarily footwear, but when you see anything linear like that, where you have defined lines to it, then it means it's some type of object that would have some corresponding pattern to it. So that's not necessarily really just from struggle. I mean, it can be occurring during the struggle, but that's not like just a swipe, where with the swipe you have, it's a very random type of pattern that has feathering to it, as opposed to these are more defined lines, which would tend to indicate that there's some type of pattern there that would be associated with some object. Now, what that is, there's just really no way to tell from that photograph. And of course, there's some blood saturation over here in this carpeted area. So this is the foyer area, the tiled area. This is that plant that was knocked over that you saw on one of the previous slides. And then there's blood saturation over in here. Wherever you're seeing blood saturation like that, that would mean that the blood source is there for some period of time. Now, that period of time could be 10 seconds or 15 seconds, depending on how much blood is coming off. But it's not just something that just passed by. It's something that actually stops there and makes some type of blood saturation. So what that means, again, is it goes back towards this dynamic struggle. There's lots of movement here. She's not just in one spot. She's pretty well moving all over in this area. And this photograph is showing the bottoms of her feet. One, because she's not wearing shoes. So any linear impressions or anything that you're seeing on the foyer can't be from her feet, because she's wearing socks. Okay, and then this photograph is showing where there's the shovel that was at the scene, and the orientation of where it's located relative to her body.
Is the shovel in a location, given the quantity of blood and multi-directional spatter patterns, where if it were located at that spot during the struggle when spatter's being thrown all over the place, it would have had blood spatter on it?
I would expect it to, because I mean, you can see that here's the shovel, there's blood all over through here, blood all over in here, and of course remember that this area where she was, the walls all the way up here, all the way up the door, this other wall that's on this side of her, have blood spatter all up the walls. So there's substantial blood spatter that's going on in this area. So you would expect that things in this area would get at least some amount of detectable blood on them.
Likewise, if the shovel were used as one of the weapons to inflict the wounds, would you expect it to have blood on it unless it's wiped down?
Right, unless it is thoroughly cleaned. If it's a weapon that created this spatter or created some of it, then it should have lots of blood on it, because you see the volume of blood that's all up these walls and everything. Any weapon that was used for that would have spatter on it, would have transferred blood on it, would be saturated blood. There would be lots of blood on that item. So the only way that you would get it into a condition where there's no detectable blood is it would have to be thoroughly cleaned.
And if it were thoroughly cleaned in your experience, would you still generally be able to obtain touch DNA off it with a swab?
No, not unless the touch DNA gets deposited subsequent to that. But you would, to clean it off and get rid of any traces of the blood, you would get rid of any traces of practically anything else, because blood is one of the most easily detected things at a crime scene. That when you use certain chemicals, that there are, luminol, for example, is a chemical that we can use for blood detection that will detect one drop of blood in 5 million drops of water, roughly thereabout. So it's very sensitive. There are a lot of ways, and other the tests that would be used, presumptive tests that are used to identify blood, while not that sensitive, are quite sensitive, that you can have blood that's not even visibly present, that you can't even see it, but you can take a sample of it and then apply those chemicals and end up with a positive reaction indicating the presence of blood.
While we're talking about the volume of blood and the spatter pattern, would any individual or individuals involved in inflicting these wounds have spatter and blood all over them as well?
I would definitely expect that, particularly considering how high up you have spatter on these walls and stuff. I mean, it would be virtually impossible to have been involved in this and not have had spatter, substantial spatter, and substantial blood transfer.
Okay.
This is just a little bit closer view to show the shovel, and then here's the shovel, and showing kind of the length of this. The shovel actually measured 2 feet 3 inches in length. And then there was some dirt present on the shovel, which the dirt present would mean two things. One is that if you were looking at the possibility that the shovel had been thoroughly cleaned, then the expectation is that the dirt would be gone too. But also the one issue that it wasn't looked at was where did the dirt come from? So one of the things that would typically be done at a crime scene if you were looking at the presence of dirt, say on a shovel, would be to sample some of the dirt and soils from the surrounding environment to see is this a shovel that's been used in this environment and it got that dirt from the yard outside, for example, as opposed to being, having acquired that dirt at another location. And then there are some, when we examined this shovel, there's actually some small purple spatters that are present on this side of it, the purpling being looking like it's the LCV that was used on the floor areas and stuff around there in the processing, but there's no apparent blood. So if they got LCV on it in the process of applying that, and there's some spattering on there, I mean, obviously anything that was in the vicinity blood-wise would also have spattered on there, but there wasn't any obvious blood that was detected on that shovel. And this is just showing another closer view. Again, you can see the dirt area, and you can actually see some of those purple spatters in there. And just another view just showing this is the front and back of the shovel, so you can see what's, that there's not any obvious blood, there's not any obvious indicators that it's been used as a weapon in this particular case. Then again, we have there's this area of saturated blood we looked at before. There's transferred blood stains on the carpet in these areas. So relative to her body, out here by her right hand, and kind of straight off from her right knee, and then over here closer to where the corner of the sofa is. This foyer, obviously, once the body was moved and they processed the tile floor area and the foyer area with the LCV. This is an after picture after that's applied. Again, all that purple discoloration you're seeing is the LCV that's been applied, and it reacts to the blood, and then you end up with these. What it tends to do is bring out impressions. It makes blood impressions that may be visible or may not even be visible at all, but it brings them out and it enhances contrast, so it becomes much more obvious. But this, of course, you'll see that the shovel was in this area, so those purple spatters that are on the shovel, it's probably getting there during the process of applying the LCV. The LCV would be applied as a spray. There are 5 footwear impressions that were documented by the crime scene investigators, and the labeling, the lettering here is not theirs. That's mine. But you have one over here on the tile floor. This would be in the kind of in the vicinity of where her head was. There's one over here on the carpet, and then kind of further to the right of that, another one, further to the right of that, and then over in this area. Those impressions, what's done to document a footwear impression is that you actually take what's called comparison quality photographs, where you take a close-up photograph, fill the frame with the impression, you put a scale in place so that you can tell the size of it from the photograph, and you're making sure that it's a very crisp, clear, high-quality picture to be used to compare to any potential footwear. So these are ones that they documented and that they actually went through those steps with. Here's the one on the tile. And you can see the pattern there and what's documented in that particular impression. That's a little bit closer view.
Are you able to tell directionality of the footwear impression?
For the previous one, for this one, the alignment would be in this direction. I can't quite tell from this which way is the toe and which way is the heel, but it's longer this way than it is this way, so it's lined up in this basic direction.
Where was the door? Is this the wall?
Yeah, this would be the wall. The door would be up here.
Do you have a wider angle so we can see exactly where this one is?
That one's right there.
Okay.
So there's your door, and there's the impression. So the alignment would be in this direction here.
Okay.
And then this one is B, which, back up, B is the one on the carpet right here. So as you go through them, it's A, B, C, D, and E. And again, this one's a little bit more difficult to make out in any real detail, but they did obviously take a close-up photograph of that one. This is on the carpet. You will not get the same level of detail in a blood impression on carpet that you'll get on a hard tile surface, because carpet tends to actually absorb some of the blood, and it'll tend to distort the impression a little bit. And then this is where impression C is located, and that's a close-up of impression C. And as you look at these, the patterns in them are not the same as the other ones. I mean, this doesn't have any of the larger, obvious types of shapes. It has a lot of small lines in it. And then this is impression D. Again, difference in the pattern. Not a full impression at all. And again, it's a carpet impression, so you don't get the level of clarity that you get on a hard surface. And then impression E. This is the one on the carpet that's nearest to where that overturned tree was. Okay, then kind of returning to Brandy Peters, obviously she had multiple gunshot wounds, and the gunshot wound to the right ear was traveling right to left, slightly back to front and downward, and of course that just tells you where the firearm is relative to her head. The head especially can be moved in all kinds of directions, so it's very difficult to tell what kind of position she was in, because she could be standing, bent over, head leaned. There's a lot of different possibilities. She had gunshot wound to the crown of the head, which is what's back here in this area. She has, of course, a gunshot wound across her arm there, and that gunshot wound across the arm aligns to the one in the chest here, which of course would put her arm up in some kind of position raised to make that wound align. So again, what's indicated by all this, that you have different gunshot wounds, different angles, arm raised, is what's going on at the time that these gunshots are taking place. So clearly she's not stationary. There is relative movement between her and the firearm, which means that, that would be consistent with a struggle going on as opposed to her just being in one spot and shots being fired. Again, she's got the gunshot wound to the left chest, and a totally different direction here. You have a downward direction of that. So again, each different shot has a different direction to it. So there's lots of movement that's going on between when these shots are fired. Shot to her into the back. This one is coming at an angle kind of like that. So again, a varied angle, different angle to it. And to the shoulder, angle coming this way. And to the forearm, the shot to the forearm, you have a stippling pattern around it, which means that you're actually getting gunpowder from the muzzle is close enough to actually strike the skin, and it causes little punctate abrasions in the skin that we generally refer to as stippling, and that's it's just an indicator of how close the muzzle is. So you're talking about a gun that's within a very short distance of her arm. Then, of course, he's got this severe head trauma, which that is all occurring in the foyer. That's occurring at the end of this whole event. But among that, you have some injuries. There are some that are documented with this ovoid shape, meaning sort of a roundish oval type shape. And then you have additional injuries that are basically all over the head. There's a depression in the skull, again, sort of an oval-shaped type depression, although a little different in shape than the previous one. Then you have various different lacerations, and you can see the different shapes to these lacerations, sort of short and teardrop shaped for some of them.
What type of object, if you can say, would you expect to make these teardrop shaped lacerations?
It would be something that would have to at least roughly approximate the shape of the wound. Any type of wound impression is the object that made it would have to at least have some part of it that would roughly approximate that shape. Because obviously, like if I were to get hit with a straight stick, then what I would see would be a sort of a linear injury. Now, obviously, there's curves to the surface of the head, which means that you won't necessarily have contact all the way. When you have smaller injuries like this, then you're expecting that it's got something smaller that protrudes from that. Now, there could be any number of possibilities, but obviously you don't get a small laceration like this when you have a large flat object, for example. It would be something that would at least roughly approximate the size and shape of that. Now, the object itself could be much bigger than that, because you can have, one object could have all kind of varying shapes and surfaces that if you're struck with one particular portion of it, you end up with this smaller laceration, but the general, whatever portion of it actually caused that injury would have to at least roughly approximate that injury.
Are you able to tell whether the object that caused this injury would have had to be one that was blunt, like a blunt object, or is it a perforating or pointed object?
This is more of that would have some type of defined shape to it. Now, I want to hesitate to use the word sharpness because I don't want to make it sound like it's a knife or something like that, but you're talking about something that has some kind of smaller edge to it. it could be a fairly blunt edge, but it's not like, this clearly wouldn't be like something with a wide flat surface hitting, because that, you would get a wound that would cover that whole area. So it's something that has at least some type of edge to it that way. Another laceration. This laceration on the sort of up here on the head and above the forehead is curved. So again, you're looking at an object that would be able to approximate that curved impression.
Meaning you would expect that the object that inflicted that wound to bear that shape itself?
Right. There would be some type of curve that would approximate that. Something that would be similar in shape. It doesn't have to be exactly perfect, because again, with curvature of surfaces and things like that, there may not be full contact with whatever the object is, but it's going to be something that roughly approximates that. And then laceration on the left side of the head has a little bit of curvature to it. That's not a particularly defined pattern to it. Various different lacerations, laceration on the right cheek in this area. Of course, a number of different lacerations, smaller sized lacerations around the head. And of course, there's a laceration here. There's a gunshot wound that we talked about here, but there's also a laceration in this area as well. And there's other smaller lacerations all around. Some of them are quite short. They're rather small lacerations. And then again, just as you go around there's just a number of different lacerations, quite a number of them. And there's also 2 ovoid fractures that were documented in the autopsy on the forehead area. And this again showing the condition of her hands. And another injury. This is the right hand with multiple abrasions.
Looking at these pictures of her hands, do you see missing acrylic nails on some of her nails? And if you can, explain in more detail what, if anything, the injuries, the lacerations to her hands may be indicative of.
Well, these particular lacerations, I mean, there could be, this is actually mostly abraded here, so there could be multiple explanations for that. There's not any real pattern to it. The big thing in reconstructing, what I look at is whenever you have pattern injuries that can be correlated or to some type of object that may have made those. These aren't really defined in that way, so we tend to refer to as a non-specific injury, that it doesn't really relate to anything that's identifiable. As to the hands and the nails, there is some damage. This being your left hand, you can actually see there's some gap in the acrylic nails there. There's some actual damage, some that are missing. I believe that one is actually, the acrylic is missing. And of course there's some areas, there's even a significant laceration here to this finger. Webbing of the hand, and this is the index finger here, and the middle finger over here, and this is a abrasion in that area. This is another view that shows again where you can see the acrylics. You can actually see a gap in the acrylic there, missing there. And all these different injuries that you're seeing again goes to the how dynamic this is. That this is, I've worked homicides where you have a person that they have all injuries are focused in one particular area. like particularly maybe just a bunch of head blows to the head. And what's indicated there is that the person never resisted, never fought. There was nothing that they just got attacked and they're, rendered unconscious, and then that's it. But this is the total opposite of that. There's a tremendous amount of struggle going on here. In fact, this is on the high end of struggle of crime scenes that I've looked at. Back of the left wrist here, again, more abrasions. So again, all this is going toward that there's a substantial struggle there. Then returning and looking at the house, we're looking, this view here, you're looking back down the hallway from the living room area toward the back of the house. So this is the back door. We talked about the curtain and stuff earlier. This is the hallway bathroom right here. And the hallway bathroom, of course, is where the children's bodies were found in the tub. The TPD crime scene investigators that looked at what appeared to be footwear impressions next to the tub here. And they looked at it. There's this photograph that shows that there wasn't any further processing done, so no LCV applied or anything to bring it up. Which again, typically if you have a footwear impression, obviously it's right next to where the children's bodies are, then the question that you'd be looking at trying to answer would be, what impression is it, whose is it, how was it made, and what's the connection here to these crimes?
What would the typical process in evaluating foot impressions and excluding possible sources of those impressions? What is the typically appropriate method of excluding potential donors to that impression? Well,
the first thing you're going to look at is people who you would have expected to be at this scene after this event. Now, with footwear impressions, obviously you have to consider what it's in. So if you have footwear impressions in blood, and it's blood from the victims, then you know that those footwear impressions are either put there while the crime is taking place or sometime afterward. So, people who are the first responders there, that's your first elimination. Generally, you're going to document those, at least photograph, if not collect footwear from those people, so that you can potentially match that to any impressions that you found, because the presence of their footwear impressions is explainable. Then you would also look at any potential, like if it's one of the victims that's involved, look at their footwear to see whether or not it's from them. And then, of course, the next thing would be is to compare footwear to any potential footwear to an individual who may have been involved or who that you may suspect is involved.
Now, when there's a large quantity of blood, as we have in this case, is it also appropriate to swab or attempt to collect blood samples from the bottom of first responders' shoes?
It would be, yes. I mean, in the very least, what I would typically do, and I've done this many times in crime scenes, where if you had, say, police officers that had to go inside the scene, prior to my arrival, is I would photograph and certainly examine, if not actually take samples, particularly if I see anything that appears to be blood on their shoes, take samples to see if they did in fact pick up blood. The main objective, though, is the footwear pattern, because if you find that pattern in blood, you want to be able to eliminate and say, is that an impression that was deposited by them as opposed to something that happened during the crime. So you could collect their shoes, you could photograph them, you could use, they even have a special impression foam that's sort of a non-healing foam, so when you step on it, it crushes the foam down into the form of the footwear impression and then leaves it there. So you can even get a three-dimensional impression. Now here you're dealing with two-dimensional impressions, so you can even use the process of taking their shoes, put them on a photocopier and run the photocopier and get a photo of it. Or what I typically would do is just put a scale to it in a flat plane and photograph the bottoms of their boots or shoes that they were wearing.
Okay.
Where this bathroom is, there was a swipe mark in blood right up here on the door casing, and that swipe mark showed directionality going into the bathroom. So you can see that you have the heaviest concentration of blood here, the edges are feathered, and it goes in toward the bathroom. And then on the carpet inside, there's a blood stain right here. And then within that blood stain, there's actually some swipe marks on each end of that. So there's some contact, obviously, some transfer of that blood. And then, of course, again, it was where the children were found, and just labeled with their names, Javante here, Tanaya over here, and Tamaya here. And near where they're found, there's some blood up here on the back of the tub. And this is just showing orientation. There was a grab handle here. And then looking specifically at Javante and looking at his injuries. He had no evidence of blunt force or gunshot injuries. Of course, he's the youngest, and at 3 years old was quite small. He was about 3'1", weighed about 25 pounds. Tanaya had, she was 6, was about 40 pounds in weight, and the bodies were processed for, as described in the reports, for latent evidence using an alternate light source. That's not uncommon that when you're in a homicide to process a body looking for evidence. The alternate light source will help you bring up things like possibly fingerprints, although that's extremely rare, but also hairs and fibers, certain transfers and things. I've even had cases where we put an alternate light source on a person and bring up a full footwear impression on the person's chest because there was some material on a person's shoe that under the right color of light, it ends up glowing, it luminesces. So, but there was some processing done for that. Nothing was found, but the thing to consider is that in any of these cases, when you have close contact, that there's generally going to be some types of transfers that would take place between people. So any of these victims, you'd expect to find some types of transfers. They were examined and nothing was found. Tanaya had blunt force injuries, or no evidence of blunt force injuries or gunshot wounds also. And then Tamaya, on the other hand, and Tamaya was about the same size as her twin sister, but weighed about 40 pounds. She did have some evidence of, there was a gunshot wound actually to the back of the head. Okay, and then
Before you move on from the gunshot wound to Tamaya, can you describe whether there's any indication of stippling present at that wound injury?
there's not any indication of, I'm sorry, there's some stippling. There was no indication of soot.
So how close would you expect, in order to cause stippling, how close, or I guess how far, what is the range that you would expect the firearm to be from the victim?
Well, it varies from firearm to firearm and from ammunition to ammunition. So to get the number down and be really exact, you have to do specific testing usually with that firearm and that ammunition to be able to do it, or with good exemplars of those. But as a sort of the textbook answer, if you're not seeing soot and you are seeing stippling, then you're probably at a muzzle to target distance that's greater than 6 inches. Stippling, you can get stippling out to, depending on the firearm, sometimes 3, sometimes 5 feet. But given what's here, I think it probably would be a little closer than that. But again, it's all you can give without doing specific testing is sort of a textbook rule of thumb answer, as opposed to being able to narrow it down. If you did specific testing, what you actually do is test at different distances, look at the density and size of the pattern, and then you compare the density and size of the test patterns to the density and size of the actual pattern, and then you're able to narrow it down to a much tighter range.
Okay. Does it vary from semi-automatic to revolver, what you would expect the stippling distance to be?
It's not so much whether it's a semi-auto or a revolver, but more to do with things like barrel length and the particular ammunition. Because you can, with the same firearm, you can use different ammunition, and depending on how the powder itself is shaped and the quality of it. I've done tests with a firearm where I used, the more expensive type of ammunition, like the police officer would carry in their firearm on duty, and get a range that's not as far out as that. If I then test the same firearm with sort of inexpensive range ammunition, where you actually get stippling apparent at a further range. So it really kind of is dependent heavily on the specific ammunition more than anything. But the barrel length also has some play in that as well.
Now with the soot deposit, tell us about that. How does that happen, and how is that different than stippling?
Well, stippling is where the actual unburned and partially burned powder particles that come out of the muzzle strike around the wound and actually make abrasions or even embed into the skin. Soot is basically like from the smoke. I mean, if you've ever, had a fire in a fireplace and then you've gone in and touched it and you end up with this black stuff all over your hand, it's similar to that. It's the byproducts of the combustion that get deposited. Soot does not travel nearly as far as the powder particles do. So what you'll typically see is very close range. You'll see potentially stippling as well as soot. And then as you move away, the soot disappears, powder particles can continue, and then you reach a certain distance where you're not seeing any of it.
Okay. And when you have soot deposit like that, obviously the victim here was found in a bathtub. Would merely being in a bathtub, would you expect that to cause the soot to go away, or would you expect there to have to be some sort of scrubbing or rubbing to get soot off of a person once it's been deposited?
Soot is not permanent by any stretch. Where the powder particles pretty much are. You're not getting rid of that because you're actually doing abrasion damage to the skin. The soot is not permanent, but generally it doesn't just come off just because of application of water. I can't say that's impossible, but if you anytime a wound is cleaned or anything like that, I mean there's generally some scrubbing that's done in order to clean a wound to be able to see those. So it doesn't come off, super easily, but it does come off.
Okay. In order for it to come off, would you expect there to have to be some sort of cleaning or scrubbing of the wound as you just described?
I think so. There would be more than just simply being submerged in water to have complete absence of
Okay.
soot.
And with respect to Maya, you showed us the different saturation patterns in the carpet and the tile. Were any of those saturation patterns from Tamaya?
Let me back up and see, make sure I'm following your question. The patterns, where were you talking about?
In the living room where you show this large patterns of blood saturation.
I think all of the saturation that was near the foyer and stuff on the carpet was Brandy Peters. I'm not sure if there was anything.
And if there's no saturation from Tamaya after having suffered a gunshot wound on the ground anywhere, what would that tell you?
Well, what it would tell you is that that wherever she's found is probably very close in proximity to where the gunshot wound took place. Obviously, if she was shot at another location outside of, removed from the bathroom where she's found with a gunshot wound, then that would have bled pretty quickly after the wound is inflicted. And so if she was, in any position other than up and moving, then you would expect that there would be at least some blood deposition. So if she falls down after being shot, it's put down, then you're going to see some blood deposition somewhere where that occurred. So in absence of that, then it would mean that she's likely shot very close to where she's actually found.
Okay. And some of the blood swipe patterns, if you could go back to those, going into the bathroom. Those were tested, right? Both the blood on the floor and the blood swipe pattern going into the bathroom where Tamaya and the other kids were found. Those were tested, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And that blood was consistent with Tamaya's?
Let me catch up to you here. Yes, that swipe mark going in is consistent with either one of the twins, but certainly Tamaya would be the explanation.
And neither of the twins had any other injuries of any kind besides Tamaya having that
That's
gunshot
right.
wound, correct?
That's right. Yes.
Okay.
With regard to the truck, this is some photographs of Mr. Segura's truck that was processed. There were a number of items collected. There were just 44 items that were actually taken from the truck, 18 of which were samples, DNA samples that were collected from various locations within the truck. And there was a sample, for example, from the back of the trunk lock, failed to give indications for the presence of blood. There were samples collected from the exterior and interior driver's door handles, steering wheel, gear shift, the gas pedal, brake pedal, driver's seat belt, all of which failed to give indications of the presence of blood. So there's a lot of sampling of different areas, but none of those areas turned up to have any blood. Samples from the exterior and interior passenger door handles that also failed to give indications of blood. Samples from the in-dash radio knobs, the knobs on the radio, as well as samples from the glove box. Again, no blood found in those. Passenger seat belt, the passenger seat belt release lever, the passenger seat right side, all of those three, no indications of blood. And then From the passenger side, floor mat, 3 areas that gave chemical indications for the presence of blood, but no DNA results were obtained. Then sample from the ignition, sample from the driver's seat release lever, sample from the driver's power window switch, and those samples that gave no indication of blood. Sample from the driver's side floor mat. There were 3 areas that gave chemical indications for the presence of blood. 2 of the areas, no DNA results were obtained. 1 area had limited DNA, and there were exclusions of all of the victims in this case. Okay. That's actually the end of the slide presentation.
Based on your review of all the forensic evidence in this case, were you able to draw any specific conclusions?
Well, mainly, obviously I've talked about the prolonged struggle involving Brandy Peters and where it starts. And I would want to clarify that I can't tell you if there's any violence that has taken place anywhere else in the house apart from where there's physical evidence of that. So, 2 people can be involved in a physical struggle that could go all over the house without bloodletting or without a gunshot being fired or those sorts of things, and not deposit any real evidence that happened. But at the point where the bloodletting is beginning to take place, that's obviously starting in the master bedroom area. She comes out down the hall, outside, is stopped, and comes back inside. And then, of course, the bulk of the violence takes place there in the foyer area. The other thing is that in terms of what we would call associative physical evidence, meaning something that connects people to a scene or to a particular crime, there just really isn't any. There's not any DNA fingerprints, anything like that connects anybody to having committed these crimes in a physical evidence sense. And I'm talking strictly in the sense of what's there in terms of physical
John, I'm
evidence.
going to object to this answer he's appearing to.
Let's just ask him another question, please, Mr. Prince. I think we've kind of gotten into chronology.
Yes, sir. In terms of the manner in which the scene was processed, are there any specific criticisms that you have that you think could or would have led to the discovery of other useful evidence?
Well, I'll first qualify and say, I'm not going to criticize in any way. I don't think that's really the way I want to look at it. But the fact is that when you lack the evidence, then consideration has to be given to other possibilities that may have been done. There are areas where there's additional types of processing. I mentioned using alternate light source or some chemical processing and things that in certain areas wasn't used. Fingerprint processing that was done strictly with powders as opposed to using some of these other tools that can sometimes bring out more detail than you would get just with a typical bichromatic powder like was used here. And of course, some of the impressions that we've talked about that there's not been eliminations done as far as some of those impressions. There are impressions that are apparent that aren't even documented, that weren't ever photographed for the purposes of comparing to other things. So to that extent, there's evidence there that just there's the potential, and I don't want to make it sound like I'm saying, yes, there would have been other evidence, but there's certainly the potential that additional things could have been found that were not. And again, I'm not trying to be critical because there's always a limitation of how far you can take crime scene processing, but in a case like this, this is the type where you would pretty much do everything you have in your disposal at that crime scene because you have multiple victims. You have a scene where you'd have an unknown perpetrator. So there's just considerable amounts of processing that you would typically do, and not all of that was done.
Thank you. I have no further questions at this time.
We would probably take a short break. We don't ask witnesses of this till we get done with everybody, okay? Keep it handy, and if I forget at the end, remind me, but, usually we got good lawyers, usually they'll cover what you want to raise, and it's better if they ask it, so I don't want to get into asking questions in the middle of things, okay? All right, well, we take 10 minutes. Please seated. You may proceed, Mr. Steve.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Knox, you mentioned it quite a few times, actually, so I just want to make sure, even though I know I'm being redundant, your purpose isn't necessarily, you're not here criticizing what law enforcement did. You're just going back and looking at what they did and pointing out things you think that they could have possibly done a little bit better.
Yes, I think that's fair.
Hindsight 2020?
Oh, yes. Yes, I mean, to clarify, I mean, like I said, there are certain limitations of what you can do in processing. I mean, you can't just process forever and ever. But I think to the extent that anything that wasn't done, it's missed opportunities, I guess would be the way to express it.
Let's talk a little bit about some of those things that we're talking about. And I know one of the biggest ones you focused on was fingerprints. You
Right.
talked about ALS and other things that can be utilized for fingerprints, right?
Right.
Okay. Isn't it true ALS really isn't utilized really for fingerprints? What ALS is a light source that you spray something on it, it luminesces on different filters, and then it brings out things like bodily fluid that used to search for semen and sexual assault type situations and things along those lines. Isn't that what really ALS's primary purpose is?
Well, no, it's used quite a bit for fingerprints as well in a couple of ways. One is that you can use fluorescent fingerprint powders. And on a lot of surfaces, especially surfaces that have texture to them, you can often get better detail. I've had cases where I get detail with that I didn't get with the regular black powder, that type of thing. But also there is a certain number, I think it's roughly 10% of the population of people whose fingerprints are inherently luminescent. So you just by the fact that you touched it, the alternate light source can bring up a fingerprint just from the light source itself.
You don't have any knowledge about what the Tallahassee Police Department crime scene analyst back in 2010 had any training in doing that specific kind of test or the ability to do that, do you?
No. The only thing I know is that there was some ALS used. It's mentioned in the reports, but I don't know what training they had or what equipment they had.
And ALS, a lot of times, whenever there's a daylight type situation or something like that, that actually the different wavelengths can get washed out by the daylight, correct?
Right. You would, if you operated in, you have to operate in low light conditions. So if you're in a lighted environment, then you got to shade it in some way to be able to use it. Yes.
And so what we're typically talking about ALS type situations are control environments at the morgue, at the Tallahassee Police Department, and in the crime scene place and everything like that. That's typically where we normally see those. Or as again, you have to do a lot of shading and things along those lines.
Yeah,
right?
you'd have to do shading. I mean, I've processed bodies in daylight out in an open field, but you have to shade it. So you'd have to set up a tent or something and be able to shade the area to be able to use it.
Okay. Some of the other fingerprint type things you're talking about, those again have to be utilized in control environment. If I think back to the old days of the Beverly Hills Cop, whenever you use the fingerprint, the super glue type thing that they do
Right.
for fingerprints that brings out those rides. That has to be a controlled environment where it confines the fumes and things like that, right?
Generally, it's done you put items of evidence into a chamber. There are some glue guns that you can use at a scene, but I'm not one that's ever used them much at a scene, more to process items of evidence in a chamber.
Let's move on. Let's talk a little bit about footprint and footprint analysis. And I understand you have some limitations when you're not an actual identifier, if you will.
Right.
But you are aware of collecting footprint.
Yes.
Okay. For a footprint comparison, there has to be a pretty distinct pattern there. And what they're looking for is not only the pattern, but they're looking also for like cuts and things that are in the grooves and all that kind of stuff, right?
If you're doing a unique identification, yes.
Okay.
You can do a class comparison where you could look at a pair of shoes, look at a pattern, and then an analyst can determine they're different class characteristics. These are two different types of shoes, and so therefore it could be eliminated. But to do a unique identification, you're right, they would be looking for unique characteristics, cuts and wear patterns and things like that.
But even for a pattern, you still have to have some sort of distinctive aspect of it, be it identified as footprint, things along those lines.
Right, there would have to be enough of it that you could recognize, that an analyst would be able to recognize and compare it to a particular shoe.
Okay. And then in this particular case, you talked a lot about these different transfers and things along those lines and these possible shoe impressions, right?
Right.
Okay. Can't even say they're a shoe impression in order to even get that far, can you?
Some of them, but there are some that as I talked about, that you couldn't really tell exactly what it is, but it's an impression of some type.
And the ones that are even more so that you can get that are typical lug style work boot type patterns, correct?
There were some that appeared to be like that, yes.
That one striation you were talking about, that was a little bit different. Nothing about that indicates that it's necessarily a footprint. It could be corduroy pants, something along those lines, something that's linear like that, right?
That's possible, yes.
Okay. And in fact, let's go back to those fingerprint things. You said they could use ALS or fingerprints possibly, but it's actually extremely rare, isn't that what you said?
For fingerprints on bodies, I was talking specifically about bodies. Getting fingerprints off of a body is a very rare find. It does happen, but it's very rare.
Talked about a cutout of the wall that they did because there were scuff marks on it. What would that tell us?
Well, the only thing would be to look at the material from the scuff marks and see if it compares to anything else. Like if you, the obvious possibility would be some type of footwear. Most of the scuff marks that were low to the floor. So if you have a shoe, you can compare the materials. What's found in the scuff mark, compare that to the material that the shoe is made of to see whether or not it can be included or excluded.
So if it's rubber, it's be something along those lines.
Right, right.
Okay. Now you would agree with me in order to do some sort of comparison, you would actually have to have the shoe to compare it to, right?
You would, yes.
Okay. So if that is done by the person that committed these murders, and that person isn't arrested for a year later, you don't necessarily know what shoes they had on, right?
That's correct, yes.
So you don't have anything to actually do the comparison to.
That's correct.
And that pretty much applies for anything. If you're trying to do some sort of comparison as it relates to those kind of things, you have to have something to compare it to.
That's right.
Let's talk about Tamaya. You mentioned there were some questions about whether or not if there wasn't any mixing of the blood, it would appear that she was shot close to where it is that she was exposed in the bathtub, right?
Right.
Okay. Those swipe marks we saw on the entryway into the hallway, those were swipe marks that went from outside in as if she was higher than she is, taller than she is, right?
Right.
So she would have had been carried in her head, brushed up against there, right? Consistent with that?
Probably so, yes.
Okay. So she would have been transported somewhere. The evidence on scene indicates she was in fact transported from one place to another.
Well, I think you could come to that conclusion, but the thing is the swipe mark doesn't necessarily mean that it came directly from her injury. So if you shot her, got blood on your hand, and then you touched that, then you could transfer that swipe. So you can't quite make that, but I think the premise of your question is sound.
Okay. It would be an indicator that she would have been transported.
Right.
Possibly
Right.
carried
Possibly,
from one
yes.
spot from another. Her hair where she had that gunshot wound, brushed against there, and placed in the bathtub.
That is be possible, yes.
And in fact, when you look at the autopsy photos for Tamaya, there really isn't any blood anywhere else on her body other than her head, is there?
That's correct.
So the likelihood of that blood just simply being on her head, being transferred onto another individual, really isn't a whole lot, and it's not even transferred around Tamaya's body, is it?
Well, I mean, if you touch the wound, then and you put your hands near it, then you could get it on you. So I can't really address how probable that is, but it is possible.
Let's go back and take a look at that master bedroom real quick. Let's talk about that phone cord. And Your Honor, for purposes, so I don't have to go back and find them on Mr. Knox's computer. I'll go ahead and print them up, and I'm going to introduce this if I can. I say to do it 142A. This phone cord we're talking about, right?
Right.
And I think your testimony was that because of that, there we go. Maybe. What we're talking about in this area right here, that's the cut we're talking about, right?
Right.
Okay. Indicate somebody cut it with a sharp knife because it's a clean cut, was your testimony, correct?
Right. They cut it with some type of object that would make a clean cut, yes.
And then, if you pull something out of it, if they're pulled apart, I mean, you'll agree with me, the phone cords aren't the most sturdy. I mean, they can be pulled apart.
It could be, yes.
Okay. You would expect to see the ends or some sort of fraying on the ends of the cord, correct?
The cord and the insulation, yes.
Okay. And in this particular case, we have that cut as your analysis, right?
Right.
Okay. And 142B.
What did you say you were going to identify these as?
The first one was 142A. This one is 142B, Your Honor.
Okay. Any objection to 142A and B? I
No, Your
understand they're just copies of what's been.
No objection.
They'll be admitted.
142B is actually a new photograph that has not been introduced up to this point, Your Honor. So at this point, I would.
With
I have no
that
objection.
clarification, is there objection?
No objection to any of these.
142A and B will be admitted.
This is the phone jack, is it not?
Yes.
And inside this phone jack, we actually see the jack itself is still in there, placed inside the jack, correct?
That's right.
And then sticking out of here, right here, are two small frayed wires, are they not?
To the best that I can tell. I mean, I'm not disagreeing with you.
All right. So that would be, again, an indicator that if somebody did in fact cut this with a knife, they cut it real close to that wall, against the wall, or it was pulled out of the wall and frayed those wires, correct?
I think so. Yeah, I mean, those would be the two possibilities.
Okay. All right. Hindsight's 20/20 for a lot of different ways, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay. Let's talk about the shovel. As I recall, the photograph that you showed us, and you talked a lot about it being the fact that with the shovel indicated that it had been placed there afterwards because there's no blood spatter on it. There's none of the purple material and stuff like that it utilized, correct?
Right.
In close proximity to that shovel was actually a wig as well, right?
Yes.
Your indications are, in reviewing this analysis, that there was none of that purple or the blood on that wig either, was there?
I don't think there was. There wasn't any documentation of it being found.
Okay. And you would agree with me that that wig would have been probably pulled off in the course of all this violent act that's being done on scene, right?
It could have been. I don't know where it originated from, but it's possible.
Okay. Well, you would agree with me that's probable, though.
Well, I don't know where, if it was on her, if it was already off on the floor. I don't know where that would normally have been.
Okay, so it would have had either been on her or actually would have already existed on the floor prior to the struggle, correct?
That's right.
Okay. Your Honor, I think this is a new photograph as well, State's Exhibit number 143.
Any objection to 143
No, Your Honor.
would be admitted.
Looking at 143 down here on the bottom, the wig is actually laying on top of the shovel, is it not?
It is.
That would be an indicator that the shovel was there prior to the struggle and the wig being deposited there, correct?
Likely so, yes.
All right. Again, of course,
Hindsight works in many different ways, right?
Right.
no further questions.
Redirect.
Just a couple of questions.
Are you going to show anything?
No, Your Honor. You talked about limited processing ability. Is that right?
Right.
Okay. Making the decision to collect boots or shoes or take pictures of an officer's footwear in order to do a class comparison and elimination analysis, no law enforcement agency is limited in any way from doing that basic work, are they?
No, no.
No. How about swabbing the bottom of a shoe to see if the officer has blood on the bottom of the shoe? Any limitation in doing that?
No.
I guess with respect to the blood transfer marks, the directional blood swipes consistent with Tamaya's blood going into the bathroom, are you in a position to offer opinion about where exactly she was killed, or is it merely that you're stating she has one wound, it's the gunshot wound, and there are blood transfer marks going into the bathroom from outside the bathroom?
That would be the extent of it, yes.
Okay. And with respect to the wig that Mr. Fuchs mentioned, isn't it true that the wig was saturated in blood and just not tested by FDLE because it was presumed it was Brandy's blood all over the wig?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. No further questions.
All right, and Jared have a question? I think, all right, we'll go sidebar. Mr. Knox, we have some follow-up questions from the jury. Could a gun barrel cause the smaller lacerations in the head and hands of Ms. Peters?
That's possible.
Could a revolver butt cause the major wound to the head?
I don't think so.
Talk to them. I know I'm asking the question,
Yeah.
but
Sorry, Your Honor. The major head wounds would have been a very, you're talking about a pretty heavy object and something with given the amount of blood spatter, something with some more length than what you would get from just a revolver.
along the same lines, there was a question, could the curved lacerations in the head be caused by the hammer of a revolver?
It would be possible for those to be caused by a revolver, not necessarily just a hammer, but by some portion of a revolver. That couldn't be eliminated. That's possible.
Does the blood spatter in the door entryway indicate a right-handed downward swing or a left-handed downward swing?
You really wouldn't be able to tell handedness from it, because with blood spatter, handedness can be the same in terms of how the spatter is deposited. So if I say we're to take my right hand and move like this, it would create the same spatter as if I took my left hand and did like this. So you really can't discern handedness in most cases.
Do clothes hinder blood spatter spread in the case of bullet wounds?
Yes.
Was there any evidence of a cleanup or effort to clean up?
Not that I saw.
Now, there's a couple of questions about DNA results, and I know you're just repeating what you're reading in reports by other persons, but I think it's already come out, so we'll go ahead and cover those. The blood on the doorway to the bathroom, do you know whose blood that was ID'd as?
Doorway to
Going into the hallway bathroom?
the swipe mark that was on the door casing going into the bathroom is matched the DNA of the twins. So it could be from either one of them, but obviously only one of them had an injury.
And while you're there, the blood on the bathroom mat, who was that identified as belonging to?
Also identified as, it could be from either of the twins.
Was there blood spatter underneath the shovel?
Not that I recall, no, but I'm not saying for certain there wasn't. I don't recall seeing blood spatter underneath it.
Do you recall whether there was blood spatter on the back of the couch?
I don't recall any on the back of the couch, no.
Could some of the linear patterns on the floor in the foyer originate from Ms. Peters' shirt?
That's possible, yes.
Oh, Mr. Prince.
With respect to the curved injuries, the way you phrased your answer was that you can't eliminate the possibility that it was caused by the butt of a gun or something like that. Do you find those injuries to be more consistent with some other object?
The main indicator would be the amount of blood spatter up high on the walls and things, and also that when you have some of these lacerations are very severe, that would indicate a heavier, bigger, longer object. I've worked a lot of beating cases where somebody's beaten with something very short, and the blood spatter will go about halfway up the wall and that's it. Whereas when a little longer item is used, then it's not uncommon to even see it all the way up on the ceiling and things like that, because there's just more opportunity for it to be flung as opposed to on a shorter item. So it couldn't rule it out, but I think that there's got to be an object that is of greater length than a gun.
Okay. And no pictures were taken of the floor around the shovel after the shovel was removed, correct?
That's right. That's right.
All right. And likewise, no pictures taken specifically of the back of the couch either, correct?
That's right.
I have no further questions.
Ross.
Yeah. Talk about the blood spatter longer instrument. How is it that a longer instrument in this situation would have indicated or would be indicated by where the blood spatter is found?
Well, it has to do with, the longer the instrument, then you're going to be able to propel it more. And in engineering terms, we call it a greater moment of force. It's kind of like if you were, to put hit a ball with a baseball bat. If you want to bunt, you hit way up on the bat close to your hands. If you want to knock it into the stands, you hit it on the end of the bat. You hit it on, much closer to the end because you're getting a much greater moment of force.
That's actually not true, is it? You actually, when you hit a baseball, you hit it with the big portion of the barrel, no matter what. If you bunt it, you hold it with both hands and you bunt it down with the barrel of the bat. Same thing when you swing, you hit right at the barrel because that's where you get the most force.
You're changing the moment though because you're moving your hands. Because the moment of force would be the distance between your hands where you're swinging and the end of the portion of the bat that you actually strike. So anytime you take anything, if you were, probably an easier analogy for me to use would be a wrench.
Now let's stick with that analogy. You brought up an excellent point. It's the force you use that dictates that, right?
Well, there's a concept known as moment of force. Torque would be a way of explaining that.
You would agree with me that if someone forces, one person may be stronger and be able to generate more force with their arms, and therefore more force back, and swinging whatever it is, no matter what instrument you've got in your hand.
Certainly different individuals can generate different amounts of force.
Okay.
But the amount of force that you're talking about and where you have blood that is coming downward up high on these walls is entirely consistent with longer weapons. I've never seen one with short weapon, the length of a revolver, where you had blood up that high.
Okay, so we're talking about a situation where an ongoing struggle. You mentioned some scuff marks were up high, indicating that she was there, fighting up while standing up, and others while down, right?
That's right.
You would agree with me with an 8-foot ceiling or whatever ceiling height this is, if they're fighting right here at height level, and obviously my height is a little bit bigger than most, but right here, height level, you don't want as far to go when you're up there, do you?
That's right.
But
That's
if
right.
you're down here, it would only get a certain height, right?
That's right.
So the fact that they're standing up and fighting while inflicting these wounds, as well as being on the ground while inflicting these wounds, is directly going to affect where that blood spatter ends up, isn't it?
That's correct.
Okay. So that is also affecting it in addition to whatever that barrel is, or what that weapon is, in addition to the fact of whatever force is being utilized.
That's correct.
Okay. Let's talk about the wound to the head. Revolvers, all different kinds of revolvers have different shapes to, and not only revolvers, any gun, have different shapes to their handles, correct?
That's right. Yes.
Okay. And in fact, that wound is only about that big round, right?
That's correct.
Okay. If it was a longer instrument such as a bat, if you're using the force you're talking about, you're going to see a much longer lineal type of injury, are you not? Because you're talking about a bat and a whole barrel.
Well, it would depend on the item. If you were talking about a bat and you're talking about a strike on the blunt surface of the bat, then you're probably going to make a bigger injury. But it could be a longer item that has different shapes or different surfaces to it. It could still end up with something similar. A crowbar, for example, you'd have almost identical shape to what you'd have to a gun, but then you'd have the added length of the shaft of it.
Okay, but a crowbar wouldn't have made that small, that round spot like that depresses the skull, would it?
No, it wouldn't.
Okay. And in fact, if you grabbed a barrel of a gun and you swung it with a hammer from the barrel, and the barrel's about that long, if you will, then you have the rest of the thing. You can have a gun that's almost that long, can you not?
That's true.
With a round butt.
That's true.
And you take it and you swing, that could certainly make that injury, could it not?
In terms of the impression, it could. Whether or not there'd be enough force to do it, but in terms of the impression, it could do it.
You would agree with me that welders and people that utilize and do things with their hands in that industry are pretty strong guys.
I'd be speculating about that. I can't really tell you how strong somebody is. I mean, it is physical work, obviously, but I couldn't tell you how strong somebody is.
No further questions.
Redirect.
What about welders recovering from intestinal surgery? How strong are they?
I mean, again, obviously, medical conditions could affect a person's strength, but I couldn't tell you what any particular person's strength is.
I guess the bottom line of what I want to ask about the blood spatter up on the ceiling, you talked about your experience as a homicide investigator and your experience evaluating crime scenes. What is that blood spatter pattern most consistent with?
It's most consistent with some type of long, heavy object.
Okay. Have you, in all the crime scenes you've ever worked, seen a spatter pattern like that, where it's 8 feet or more in the air with some short little object?
Never.
No further questions.
All right. You can step down. Call your next witness.
It's time the defense will call Mark Lewis.
We need to keep this witness any further.
Okay.
No, I'm there.
Your excuse.
Thank you.
You remain under oath, Sergeant Lewis.
Yes, Your Honor.
What are you trying to do?
Let's catch Mr. Knox
Well,
disappearing
we
with
got
our
them on.
equipment.
Play them on. Take it up, please. Get rid of this.
While we're getting that hooked up, I'll go ahead and introduce the disc. Mr. Lewis, Investigator Lewis, can you please state and spell your first and last name again?
Good morning, Investigator Mark Lewis, M-A-R-K-L-E-W-I-S.
And you had a chance to view that disc and authenticate it prior to coming into court today, right?
I don't know what's on that disc, sir.
The disc that we showed you outside?
Yes,
Okay. And it's a fair and accurate depiction of the portions of the interview you and Investigator Anne-Marie Johnson at the time conducted with the defendant, correct?
yes.
At this time, I would move in evidence what was pre-marked for identification only, as Defense Exhibit 8 into evidence as Defense Exhibit 8 and request permission published to the jury.
No objection, Your Honor.
Are we going to be using a transcript along with this or not?
No, Your Honor, there aren't copies of that transcript.
All right, Defense Exhibit 8 will be admitted. You may publish it.
Call it the woman in me, or call me just whatever, but I gotta ask. Alright, call it the woman in me, or call me just whatever, but I gotta ask. Are you seeing anybody else besides Malika? And know that I'm not gonna go talk to Malika and tell her anything like that, okay? You know, we've talked to a lot of people, and people talk, and people say things, and we're not the moral police, you know, you do what you do, and all that. We need to know now. All right, call it the woman in me.
Who do you communicate with on email? Do you find jobs with it?
No.
Okay. Do you communicate with other women with it?
I honestly don't feel like answering questions like this.
Okay.
I don't think they have anything to do with this case.
Okay.
Obviously, we're just showing you some excerpts. I encourage the attorneys not to have us listen to 4 hours of a tape that much of which was repetitive or not very helpful. So they've picked out just certain excerpts to show you from the statement.
Support.
She ain't threatening
So
to
you're
have
already
this.
back on you're already not paying your mortgage on time. You're behind a couple months on your child support. Now you're looking at getting arrested and not being able to work because of that. You're going to lose your driver's license. How do you get back and forth to work? You drive. You can't work. I understand all of that. I know your position.
Obviously, you don't.
Okay.
But
Well,
you still
then
come at
explain
me
it to
as
me.
if
I know you weren't home, and I know you were over at her house on Friday. Okay? We have to get past that.
Okay, we get past that. Now what? What I'm supposed to be doing? Telling you what? I didn't have anything to do with it. So what am I supposed to get past or get
You
forward
did have
to?
something to do with it.
No, I didn't.
You did have something to do with it.
No, I didn't.
What were you doing at Brandy's house then on Friday?
I wasn't at Brandy's house.
Apparently she has information that says you were. This is not a bluff. This isn't poker. This has to do everything with you. And it's true when we say we can't turn back that clock. We can only work from this moment on. Right? And like I told you the other day, I'll tell you now, as soon as you have kids, it is no longer about parents. It's about about parents. It's about the kids, right? And you need to be thinking about Malachi, Henry, and Malika, and their best interests. If not Malika, at least your kids, the ones that you know are yours.
The ones you've been taking care of, the ones you've been supporting.
There's a person out here who can't empathize with your situation, especially in this day and age, in this economy. And then
I'm behind on child support with my other baby mama. Well, I'm gonna kill her too. And I'm just gonna kill off everybody because I want money. What about the bill collectors? I owe money. I'm kill them. Don't make sense.
you're absolutely right. That doesn't make sense, Henry.
That's not something I would do. I wouldn't,
Why wouldn't you kill somebody?
because it's not right. That's not me. I just can't do it. I just wouldn't do it.
Isn't there a side of you that can get upset? That can get angry?
Yeah.
And maybe those buttons were pushed, the moons were aligned right, the buttons were pushed the right way, and something spiraled. I don't think that you woke up planning on killing anybody. I don't think that. And I really do think that you're a good guy.
But you do believe I killed somebody?
Well, parent court information this lady has.
Yes,
over
I
here.
do. Yes, I do. Okay? I'm gonna be straight up with you. I know you had something to do with it, okay? I know you weren't at home. I know you were over there. I'm telling you this, and I'm urging you to be as honest as you can be with us, okay? As honest as humanly possible, because at the end of the day, I have to tell your story. And I can't go up there and stand up there in front of other people and tell them, he lied. He lied about this, he lied about this, he lied about this, he lied about this. He showed no remorse whatsoever. He had an opportunity to tell us and explain why it got to that point, because I don't believe it was supposed to end up that way. I don't think you went over there with that intent. And listening to the type of person Brandy was, she did just what he said. She pushed and she pushed and she pushed. And I'm telling you, looking at humans, you can only push so much. Okay? I think she maybe threatened to go to Malika about something, and she was pushing, and Malika means something to you.
Malika knew everything about me and Brandon.
You know? There was something that she continued to push you on, okay?
Nothing.
Well,
She wasn't pushing me on anything. I know I had to pay the child support. Like I said, I signed myself up for it.
Mm-hmm.
I know what I had to do. I know my responsibilities. I was going to get to it whenever I started getting back on a long-term job.
Did you think that you were going to have to pay $700 or $800 a month in child support for one child that you really aren't sure is yours?
Oh, no. No, I didn't think I was going to have to pay that much. But regardless, I already talked to the people down at the city. She said I had to pay $300-something, fill some paperwork out, and they would give me a DNA test. So you pay child support until then, and I wasn't going to pay $700-something. I was going to just pay something towards it so they wouldn't suspend my driver's license or they wouldn't arrest me because I'm making payments towards it. Once you do that, they don't arrest you or suspend your driver's license until I got the DNA test and was sure.
support.
She ain't threatening to
So
have
you're
me
already
arrested.
Investigator Lewis, with respect to that first clip, it got cut off early, but fair to say there was extensive discussion during the interview with Mr. Segura about whether he was cheating on his wife, whether he was seeing other women, sleeping with other women, attempting to sleep with other women. Is that a fair characterization?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. That video that we just watched, that took place on November 30th, right?
Yes.
Before the first DNA report had come back, before the first forensic report had come back, any of that, correct?
I believe. I don't know those dates.
Is it true that the primary reason why we see the tone of the interrogation that we do is because you guys were already aware that he had lied about being at the victim's house on the day of the murder?
That's correct.
Okay. I want to ask you some questions. Well, first let me go back to kind of what your role was here. I know we discussed at the very beginning of the case. You're the lead investigator for this case, correct?
Yes.
And like Mr. Fuchs described, that the lead investigator for a case is kind of the head coach. There are other investigators working on it, but you're the head guy on this particular case.
That would be correct.
Okay, so ultimately, any decision about what leads to follow up on, what evidence to send for testing, it's to you, correct?
No.
Who would that go to?
We discuss things amongst ourselves.
Okay. At any rate, it's the investigators working on the case, yourself included, that make those decisions, right?
Yes.
Okay.
I want to ask you some questions about the processing of Jack McLean Park. You were aware of that and had an opportunity to review evidence related to that scene?
Yes.
May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
You may.
Let the record. May I approach the witness?
You may.
Can you take a look at those and confirm that those are a fair and accurate depiction of the Jack McLean scene that you guys processed in this case? Is that a fair and accurate depiction of the Jack McLean scene you guys processed?
Yes.
I'm moving the evidence for remark for identification only as defense A through EE and as defense 9A through EE.
Any objection?
No.
Be admitted.
May I publish, Your Honor?
You may.
Let's take a look at this first photograph that we're looking at here. This is just an overview of the bathhouse that was processed, right?
Yes.
For the record, this is 9A. Inside this bathroom, there were, I'm sorry.
Okay.
It's rare that I'm accused of being too quiet, but I'll speak into the microphone so everybody can hear me. There were items of possible evidentiary value that were located and identified inside this bathroom that were processed as part of your investigation, correct?
Not inside the bathroom, but there was a garbage can out front.
Okay. There were items that were photographed inside the bathroom,
There were.
including a possible blood stain on the sink.
If it is, yes.
Okay. Now looking at 9B. This is a wider shot of the same bathhouse with the pavilion near it where other items were photographed and tagged as part of evidence, correct?
Yes.
And it's it's near this pavilion that the new clothing tags were discovered and collected, correct?
I believe so.
Specifically, now we're looking at 9C. In this area over here is where the new clothing tags were found, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And looking at 9D, over by that same pavilion, you guys located what appeared to be a burned out trash can, correct?
Yes.
There was evidence looking in that readily identified it as having been burnt, correct? Soot and ash and things of that nature.
Yes.
Okay. And just so you can be aware of where that trash can was relative to the pavilion, that's a picture of the same trash can a few feet back from the concrete base of the pavilion, correct?
Yes.
Okay. For the record, that was 9E. This is a picture of the burnt contents immediately on top of the trash can when you looked inside, right?
Yes.
And we can see here with this can and other items, evidence that the contents were burned or attempted to be burned, correct?
Yes.
The picture's a little dark, but more evidence of the same. We can see where the bag is burnt, items with paper inside, all evidence of being burnt, correct?
Yes.
Also inside the trash can, you guys were able, this would be 9H, you guys were able to identify items like latex gloves indicated there next to the number 10 evidence marker, correct?
Yes.
And you also found some clothing items, is that correct as well?
Yes.
That shirt was found inside the trash can?
Yes.
And also inside the trash can, you guys located a bottle of bleach and some shop towels, correct?
Yes.
And just for reference, this is all taking place on the 26th, so less than a week after the murder, right?
It's about a week after the murder, yes.
Inside the same trash can, or maybe this is a different trash can over by the wash house, you also located an undershirt with possible blood stains, correct?
That's correct.
And that's the shirt we see indicated there with number 6 next to it.
Yes.
Was there an image of the same shirt depicting the stains, right?
Yes.
That last one was 9M for the record. I'm sorry, yes, 9M. And there were actually, you couldn't see it in the first photo of the gloves, but there were actually many pairs of latex gloves found within the trash can, right?
It appears to be, yes.
That was 9N. Another close-up of latex gloves found.
Yes.
And ultimately, the latex gloves, or the place where the latex gloves were deposited, was marked with a evidence marker by Tallahassee Police Department forensic, that's right.
Yes.
Some of the items found over by the pavilion actually had UPC codes on them, such as this one here next to the number 3 evidence marker, right?
Yes.
And that one that I just showed you, it actually it was collected and saved as an exhibit of evidence, right?
Yes.
And it was for a size 12 men's shoe, right?
I can't read that, sir.
You don't recall?
I don't recall.
Okay. Also present were stickers for more new cans, correct?
Yes,
Indicating the place of purchase at bottom, Walmart, with fully intact UPC code.
it appears to be yes.
And then turning to the interior of the restroom, the forensic specs did go inside the men's restroom there and process for potential evidence as well, right?
Yes,
Inside one of the stalls, one of the shop towels was located in the toilet. Is that right?
I presume yes.
Okay. And there was also a paper towel found with possible blood stain on it. Correct?
I presume yes.
Is that an image from inside the same stall with a piece of the shop towel in there?
It appears to be yes.
And a picture of the wadded up paper towel on the side with possible blood stain.
Yes.
And then over on the sink, it was inside, that area, the area around both sinks was processed and photographed as well, correct?
I don't recall if it was processed, but it was photographed.
And possible blood stain was also located and photographed on the sink as well, correct?
If that is a blood stain, yes.
And to determine, that's all the pictures I have to publish, Your Honor. And to determine whether it's a blood stain, the first thing that you would expect your forensic folks to do, or that you would instruct them to do, is to test for serology, swab it, and do an initial blood test on it, correct?
Yes.
Was that done on that stain?
I don't recall. I don't know.
It wasn't, was it?
I don't recall, so I guess not.
Okay. What about the paper towel that was located in the stall? It was never sent to FDLE for testing or processing, was it?
No.
What about the
Move the mic back around towards you, please.
What about the bottle of bleach that was located outside? It was never swabbed or sent to FDLE for possible DNA touch processing, was it?
I don't recall, so no.
And the latex gloves that were found inside the trash can, never swabbed for possible touch DNA processing and sent to FDLE, were they?
I don't recall, so no.
And even if some of these items, like the latex gloves, had been sent to FDLE, and in fact I think some of them were, and no touch DNA analysis was done, TPD has the ability to send them back and say, hey, test these for touch DNA, correct?
I'm not familiar how FDLE would process that once it's sent back. I presume yes.
Okay. With respect to the shirt with damage to the sleeve and possible blood staining, that was never swabbed around the collar or in the armpits for possible touch DNA and sent to FDLE either, was it?
Not that I recall, no.
Okay. And the blood on the sleeve, never swabbed and sent to
I don't
FDLE.
object, there's been no testimony about any blood on the sleeve.
Let me rephrase. Possible blood on the sleeve, never swabbed and sent to FDLE for possible DNA analysis if it were blood, correct?
I don't know anything about that shirt, so no.
And how about the dress shirt that was found with the undershirt? That wasn't swabbed around the collar and the armpits for possible touch DNA and sent to FDLE for analysis either, was it?
I'm not familiar with the dress shirt, sir.
Okay. When you're making determinations about whether to submit items to FDLE, one for DNA comparison in particular, one of the relevant things that you want to consider is whether there's going to be DNA from the scene to compare it to, correct?
Yes.
And as late as 2016 in this case, you believed that there was no DNA to compare evidentiary samples to, or to compare no standards to, as the lead investigator in this case, because you believe the scene had been wiped down or cleaned up. Isn't that true?
Yes.
I have no further questions for the witness at this time.
Cross.
Investigator Lewis, I want to clear something up real quick. Jack McLean Park was not processed until a week after the homicides, correct?
That is correct.
So for us to believe that the towels and things like that that were shown in the toilet are of evidentiary value, that would presume that somebody had not gone to Jack McLean Park and flushed those toilets or done any kind of cleanup, being the city of Tallahassee or whatnot, in over a week.
Yes.
Okay. Would that factor into your decision about sending certain items off?
Yes.
And I know you're not a DNA analyst or anything like that, but there are also issues because of the fact, obviously, law enforcement, when they go to a crime scene, they section it off and they try and reduce any kind of cross-contaminational aspects and things like that, right?
Yes.
And that's for the purposes of preserving the scene and making sure things like DNA aren't cross-contaminated by other items or other people, correct?
Yes.
And we're talking about in a situation here where it's a public park that's been exposed to not only the elements, but people coming in and out that you've got no way of tracking. Would that also factor in as far as any kind of potential DNA analysis and cross-contaminations and things along those lines?
Exactly.
Okay. So even if it get some sort of DNA at that park a week later, you have no way to be able to tell who it was, or not necessarily who it was, but when it was deposited or anything like those lines.
That is correct.
Over the question.
Read correct.
Yourself, the Tallahassee Police Department investigators obviously thought, I'm sorry? Yourself and other Tallahassee Police Department investigators obviously believe that there was some evidentiary value to the scene at Jack McLean because you went there and processed everything, right?
We went there for follow-up.
Follow-up to what?
We were looking for evidence at Jack McLean Park.
Evidence related to this case, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And the reason that you believe this particular scene might have evidence relative to this case is because you found a burned up trash can with possibly bloody clothes, possible blood spatter on a sink, gloves, latex gloves, a bleach bottle, shop towels. That all looked like something that might be a cleanup scene relative to this murder, right?
We had to consider it, yes.
Okay. Now you talk about whether you would be able to get DNA off of these items. You don't know unless you try, really, do you?
True. Yes.
I have no further questions at this time.
All right, any juror have a question of this witness on this subject? All right, you can step down.
I thought I saw a hand.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see it. Was there a hand? Yeah. Okay, all right. We'll go to sidebar. Couple of follow-up questions from the jury. Do you know whether the park was, and we're obviously talking about Jack McLean Park, was cleaned between November 19th and November 26, 2010 by the city?
I could presume yes, because daily city bathrooms are cleaned.
This is a similar question, but maybe slightly different. Do you know when the trash cans are routinely picked up by the city at Jack McLean Park?
No, I do not.
And why did you not have the clothes and bleach bottle tested, assuming that did not occur?
I didn't know if they were related to the case or not.
Mr. Prince?
Yes, sir. Investigator Lewis, you said you can presume that the trash cans were changed and the bathrooms cleaned. Is that right?
Yes.
You didn't do any checking at all with the city of Tallahassee to see if they were actually changed, did you?
No.
Okay. And the week that you guys processed that scene was Thanksgiving week, so if there was normal maintenance, it may not have been done that week anyway, correct?
I just know from my experience, The city of Tallahassee cleans their bathrooms, public bathrooms, on a daily basis.
Have you ever been to Jack McLean Park before?
Yes, I have.
Are those bathrooms typically sparkling clean, like they're cleaned every day?
I know they're cleaned every day. The city has a crew. They send out to all the public bathrooms that clean the bathrooms.
Do you have specific knowledge that this bathroom was cleaned at any point between the murder and the day you guys processed the scene?
No.
Okay? And if you did presume that the bathroom had in fact been cleaned, why would you guys have processed the scene at all?
We went out there following up on information.
That there might be evidence related to this murder there?
Yes.
No further questions.
And further,
Let's talk real quick about, I think you pretty much cleared it up. You've been working with Tallahassee Police Department how long?
A little over 23 years.
Over those 23 years, you've been on the road at some point?
Yes.
Different times, and I think you talked about earlier, you had just come back to Criminal Investigative Division.
Yes.
Prior to that, you were on the road.
Yes.
Prior to your first role with Criminal Investigative Division, you were on the road.
Yes.
You've had numerous investigational aspects, including things that have happened at parks.
Yes.
Whenever you say, I presumed it was clean, do you utilize your background, your information, through road patrol, through CID, prior investigations, all the knowledge that you've had up to this, over those 23 years to make a presumption, if you will, that those are cleaned on a daily basis?
Yes.
Okay. And again, so you're really not making a presumption, you're making an educated decision or thought.
Yes.
Okay. Asked of why would you process it anyway? Isn't it true, as you said in the end of the interview, that you are going to leave no stone unturned and that you're going to do a whole lot in order to get this done, correct?
Yes.
You're even going to go out and investigate certain things, even though they're probably not going to lead to anything.
Yes.
Okay. And that's because you wanted to conduct a thorough investigation to the best of your abilities, correct?
Yes.
Hindsight's 20/20, as we heard from previous witness, that some things can be overlooked, correct?
Yes.
Okay. But you did the best given the knowledge that you had at that time, correct?
That is correct.
No further questions.
further.
Your testimony to Mr. Fuchs is you want to leave no stone unturned. It wouldn't have taken much more effort to send the evidence that you collected to FDLE for processing, would it?
No.
Okay. Going back to your presumption that the trash cans had been cleaned, for example, even if the trash cans had been cleaned, that doesn't necessarily mean the ground, the dirt would have been swept up or litter, small pieces of litter picked up, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And so in your training and experience as a law enforcement officer, isn't it true that if you have a UPC code, you can use that if it's within the retention period for a particular store to get surveillance footage of the purchase where the UPC code was, attached to an item that was bought?
That is possible.
But no efforts were made to do that either, correct?
I'm not aware of that.
No further questions.
You can step down.
Okay.
We can take a lunch break. Let's plan to be back and going at 1:30, please. All right, either side need anything? And a reminder, the attorneys, we're going to work on jury instructions if we have time at the end of the day, so need to be thinking about that. I'm sorry, I'm not talking to y'all. We have a few other things we work on.